I'm Colton, a 34 years old man living in suburban Texas who believed he had built the ideal life with Aurora, my wife of many years. Friday nights are usually the time of the week I look forward to the most, if only to get home to my small house in suburban Texas, sit on my old sofa, and enjoy a few hours of quiet after a long work week. But today was different. My wife, Aurora, texted me that she wanted to talk to me about something important when I got home. The message hung in my head all day, making me feel uneasy. I pushed the door open and entered, feeling an unusual chill throughout the house. Aurora was sitting on the chair, looking relaxed, but her eyes were full of tension. The red dress she was wearing reminded me of the first days we dated, the days when I always thought she was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen. But tonight, that red color did not evoke sweet memories, but instead a feeling of something ominous. "Colton," she began, her voice direct and decisive. "I want us to talk about the future." I sat down across from her, trying to stay calm. "Okay, what is it?" She paused, as if trying to find the words, but when they came out, they were sharp as knives. "I want a free marriage. I want the freedom to seek out new experiences, new people, and I've already started." The words were like a punch to the chest. I felt my blood stop. "What do you mean, Aurora?" I asked, my voice shaking uncontrollably. "We're not who we are anymore, Colton," she continued. "You're always busy with work, and I need to feel alive, loved in a way that you can't give me." I sat there, half wanting to scream, half wanting to laugh at the absurdity of the situation. But instead of reacting, I remained silent, feeling my heart crushed. Finally, I blurted out, "Aurora, if you've already done this, why do you need my permission? You've already decided, right?" She nodded, and I caught a hint of guilt in her eyes, though it did nothing to ease the pain. "I just thought that if we were honest with each other, we could both find happiness in our own way." "Happiness?" I repeated, almost laughing. "Aurora, happiness doesn't come from destroying everything we've built." She stood up, reaching for her bag nearby, preparing to leave. "I think we should take some time apart," she said, not looking directly at me, "to give us both some space to think." I watched Aurora walk out the door, each step feeling like she was stepping on a piece of my heart. When the door closed behind her, the house became suffocatingly silent. I sat there, cold beer in hand, trying to digest what had just happened. Perhaps this was the moment I knew my life would never be the same again. But I also didn't know that it would open up a new path, a path I had never imagined. I sat there for a long time after Aurora left, the house now a lifeless shell. I wondered how it could have all fallen apart so quickly, from the passionate dates in college to the promises of eternal love in a small wedding at a local church. All that was left was a broken memory. Aurora had been everything to me, but today she was gone, not just from this house, but perhaps from my life. I held the cold beer, but it did nothing to ease the ache in my heart. The alcohol didn't seem strong enough to ease the humiliation and anger that was slowly rising inside me. Part of me wanted to stand up, run after Aurora, and tell her she was wrong. But another, weaker part of me just wanted to wallow in the feeling of loss. It felt like I had lost not only a wife, but also my faith in myself. Looking around, I realized that the house that was once filled with laughter was now an empty space, where every object seemed to be a cruel reminder of my failure. The framed wedding photo on the mantelpiece now looked like a joke. The walls that had once been warm were now strangely cold. I jumped up, walked to the refrigerator, and opened it, only to find a bottle of water, a few boxes of leftovers, and a large empty space inside, much like my life at that moment. Anger rose in my chest, but it was quickly replaced by helplessness. I wondered what I had done wrong. Was it because I was working too much? Or had I missed the warning signs when she started to drift apart? I searched for answers, but everything just led to another question. If I loved her so much, why did she leave? As the clock approached midnight, I decided not to be cooped up in this house any longer. I grabbed my car keys, threw on a jacket, and stepped outside. The cold Texas night air blew across my face, but at least it made me feel more awake. I drove to my usual bar, a place where I always felt welcomed as part of the family. Miles, the barman, was standing behind the counter, wiping down glasses with his usual slowness. When I walked in, he looked up, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Colton, tonight isn't your usual night," he said, half joking. "Just give me a beer, Miles," I replied, sitting down on my usual bar stool. "And don't ask any more questions." Miles said nothing, just nodded and placed a cold beer in front of me. But he wasn't the type to stay silent for long. "Did something happen?" he asked after a moment, his tone softer. I laughed bitterly, shaking my head. "My wife wanted to have a free marriage," I said, feeling my words carry more weight than the beer in my hand. "And guess what? She started it without my consent." Miles whistled, setting his glass down on the counter. "Damn, Colton, I didn't think she'd do that." "Yeah," I said, taking a sip of beer. "I didn't think so either, but she did." The room fell silent for a moment, save for the chatter and laughter of the other guests. Miles sat down across from me, his eyes full of sympathy I didn't expect but needed. "Do you have a plan?" he asked. "What are you going to do next?" I shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe I'll finish this beer, then go home and sleep. Or at least try to sleep." Miles nodded, but before he stood, he reached into his apron pocket and pulled out a stack of scratch-off tickets. "Try your luck," he said, placing them on the counter. "If you don't know what to do, at least a little luck won't hurt." I wasn't going to do it, but part of me, the part that was looking for any excuse to escape reality, decided to try. "Okay," I said, taking a ticket. "Only because you suggested it." I scratched the ticket with a coin in my pocket, and for a moment, I couldn't believe my eyes. The 3 matching numbers appeared before me. Miles leaned over the counter, looked at the ticket, and exclaimed, "You just won $25,000, Colton." I sat there, my emotions mixed. This wasn't what I expected, but in that moment, it felt like a small ray of light in the darkness. I laughed not out of joy, but at the absurdity of it all. Yes, Aurora had left me, but at least I had some semblance of hope to start over, though I didn't know what to do with it. As I drove home that night, I felt as if I were in a strange dream. The $25,000 in scratch-offs in my pocket reminded me that good fortune can come from the most unexpected places. But what I really needed wasn't money. It was clarity. I needed to understand how my marriage, something I had believed in so completely, had become the wreck it was. Images of the past came rushing back, as if someone was playing an old movie in my head. I remembered the first time I met Aurora on campus, at a student fair. She was unlike anyone I had ever met, confident, intelligent, and charming. When she smiled, I felt like everything around me faded away. For a country boy like me, Aurora was a dream come true. Little did I know that this strong attraction would eventually drive us apart. We quickly became a couple admired by our friends. Aurora was the planner dates at small cafes, weekend hikes through national parks. I, on the other hand, was just a pushover, always willing to go along with whatever she wanted. "Colton, you're the best rock I've ever had," she once told me. Hearing that made me feel like I had conquered the world. When we got married right after graduation, I thought our lives were perfect. Aurora started working in the media industry, where she quickly impressed me with her sharpness and determination. I, with an engineering degree in hand, took a job repairing and maintaining industrial equipment. My job wasn't glamorous, but it paid well. We bought a small house in the suburbs with a white picket fence and flower garden Aurora had always dreamed of. The first years of our marriage were wonderful. Aurora and I spent our weekends watching movies, hanging out in the local park, and planning our future. She wanted to travel, and I wanted to save up to build a solid home. But I didn't realize that our dreams, while not contradictory, were not in sync. Then things started to change. Aurora's work became busier as she got promoted. Dinners together began to become less frequent, replaced by late meetings with colleagues. I tried to ignore the change, telling myself it was temporary, that things would go back to normal once she reached her goals. But a nagging feeling began to creep in as she began to talk more about the people she met at work, people with ambition and energy that, even without saying it, I knew I couldn't match. We still tried to maintain a normal marriage, but the conversations became dull. We talked about bills, work, and the coming week, but we didn't share dreams or plans like we used to. Sometimes I wondered if she realized that I was trying my best to keep things balanced. I worked overtime, took on long shifts away from home to make sure we could pay off our mortgage and save a little for the future, but it just didn't seem like enough. One night, When I returned from a 3-day business trip, I found Aurora sitting in the living room, her eyes staring into the distance. I asked her what was wrong, and she simply said, "Nothing," but I knew it wasn't true. Aurora had begun to change, and I didn't know how to stop her. I could not forget those eyes, the eyes that I had loved so deeply, but now only reflected the distance between us. For the first time, I felt worried that we were not only going through a difficult time, but perhaps approaching the end of our marriage. But instead of facing that fear, I did what I thought was best: let it go and keep trying. The biggest problem wasn't the time we spent together, but how we handled it. Aurora was someone who demanded attention and affirmation from those around her, and when I wasn't there to provide it, she sought it elsewhere from coworkers, friends, and social circles. At first, I convinced myself that this was normal. She was a social person, and her job required it. But when the late night texts, hour-long work calls, and unscheduled business trips became more frequent, I knew something was wrong. One evening, after coming home late from a company meeting, Aurora walked into the living room where I was waiting for her. She took off her high heels, put her bag on the table, and smiled faintly. "How was your day?" I asked, trying to break the heavy atmosphere. "Good," she said curtly, not meeting my eyes. She poured herself a glass of wine and sat down across from me. "I was just thinking about bigger things. Do you ever feel stuck, Colton?" Her question caught me off guard. I didn't know how to respond. "Stuck? What do you mean?" Aurora took a sip of wine, her eyes looking out the window. "It's like we're living a life that isn't our own. I feel like I'm trying to do everything that other people expect of me, but I don't know what I really want." I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd heard her say something like that, but this time there was something different. Her words weren't just plain whining, they carried a determination, a will to change. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "Aurora, I don't know what you're thinking, but if you're not happy, we can do something about it. You know, I'll always be here, by your side." She nodded, but her eyes remained distant. "Maybe I just need some space," she said, "to think about it all." I didn't know what to say. I had always tried my best to give her a stable life, a home, but it seemed like it wasn't enough. Aurora wanted more, and I began to realize that I couldn't give her what she needed. This not only saddened me, but also made me feel like I had failed, not just as a husband, but also in keeping what was once my heart. As time went on, the distance between us grew wider. I remember one time I tried to arrange a romantic dinner at home: candles, flowers, and her favorite steak. But when Aurora walked in, saw the carefully laid table, and just frowned and said, "Colton, that's sweet, but I'm too tired to eat tonight. I'm having dinner with my colleagues after the meeting." I watched her walk across the table, leaving me alone with the half-burnt candles. That evening, I sat with the bottle of wine we were supposed to share. It was at that moment that I realized, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get Aurora back. Then one day, I found a small box in my bedroom, and inside was a gift I had never seen before: an exquisite necklace with a price tag still attached, from a high-end jewelry store I knew I had never been to. When I asked Aurora about it, she just smiled and said, "Oh, it's a gift from my boss. He gave it to all the women on our team after we finished a big project." I wanted to believe her, but a little voice in my head kept gnawing at me. The details that didn't fit, the late nights, the vague explanations, all like pieces of a larger picture I didn't want to see clearly. That night, I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. Aurora slept next to me, but it felt like she was in another world. I wondered, how did two people who were once so deeply in love become two strangers lying next to each other in silence? The next morning, when I woke up to go to work, Aurora had already left the house. I looked out the window, seeing the first rays of sunlight filtering through the curtains. But instead of feeling hope, I felt a strange emptiness. Perhaps deep down, I knew that we were coming to an end, but I didn't know it would come so quickly and so cruelly. After a brief moment of reflection, I found myself parked in front of Miles's bar. The old wooden door creaked as I pushed it open, and a familiar atmosphere immediately enveloped me: the smell of beer, the laughter of acquaintances, and country music playing on an old record player. This was a place I often went to escape reality, and today was no exception. Miles, the barman, was wiping glasses behind the counter, looking up at me with a look of familiarity and curiosity. "Colton, I thought you were staying home tonight," he said, raising an eyebrow. "I should have," I replied, taking my usual seat at the counter. "But I needed space to think." Miles nodded, not asking any more questions. He handed me a cold beer. "Drink this. You look like you've been hit by a truck." I laughed, but the laugh sounded flat even to myself. "Not far from the truth, Miles." We sat in silence for a moment. I could sense that Miles wanted to ask something, but he knew when to keep quiet. After a few sips of beer, I looked up at him. "Aurora left me," I said, the words coming more easily than I thought they would. "She wanted a free-for-all. Actually, she started before she asked me." Miles didn't look surprised. "I'm sorry, Colton, but maybe this is for the best. Someone who disrespects you like that isn't worth your life." I nodded, but the truth was that his words did nothing to ease my mind. We changed the subject, talking about the local football team and the gossip of the town. But as I was about to leave, Miles pulled a stack of scratch-off tickets from a drawer. "Try your luck," he said, placing them on the counter. "You seem to need them tonight." I smiled faintly, but the weariness in my heart prevented me from refusing. "Okay," I replied, pulling a ticket from the stack. "But don't get your hopes up." Miles thrust another ticket into my hand. "Scratch this one, and consider it my treat." I took the coin out of my pocket and scratched off the first ticket. Nothing. I picked up the second one and scratched it off too. And this time, the symbols that appeared made me blink a few times to make sure I wasn't mistaken. "No way," I muttered, my heart starting to race. Miles leaned over the counter, eyes glued to the ticket in my hand. "What the hell? You just won $25,000, Colton." I froze, as if all my senses had shut down for a few seconds. When I regained my composure, I couldn't help but laugh. $25,000? I repeated, as if asking if this was a joke. Miles patted me on the shoulder, laughing. "That's right. This is the first time I've seen someone win this big in my shop. You're so lucky." But I didn't feel that way. I looked at the ticket in my hand, and instead of excitement, a strange feeling came over me. Half bitterness, half satisfaction. This money couldn't buy back the happiness I'd lost, but it was a reminder that life has a way of bringing unexpected opportunities, even when you least expect it. "Maybe this is the fresh start I need," I said, setting the empty beer bottle down on the counter. "But Miles, don't tell anyone, okay?" Miles winked, holding up his hands. "I won't say anything, but you should decide soon what you're going to do with the money." I nodded, folded the ticket, and stuffed it into my wallet. On the way home, my mind was racing with ideas about how to use the money. Pay off the mortgage? Fix up the house? Or simply save it for a future I wasn't sure about? Either way, I knew I wouldn't tell Aurora. This was my luck, and I wasn't about to share it with someone who had abandoned me. When I got home, the silence of the room didn't bother me as much as it had before. I sat down on the sofa and looked around again. This house had once been a place where Aurora and I shared our dreams, but now it belonged only to me. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could start over, even if the road ahead was challenging. In the days that followed, I tried to get back to normal. The $25,000 in lottery money was still sitting in a safe deposit box at the bank, and I wasn't in a rush to decide what to do with it. Instead, I focused on filling the void left by Aurora, cleaning the house, mowing the lawn, and reminding myself that I needed to keep moving forward, even if my heart wasn't quite ready. One Saturday night, I decided to go back to Miles's bar. I needed to get away from the familiar four walls, see familiar faces, and maybe feel a little bit of the energy of life that I had missed in the past. The bar hadn't changed much, still a cozy space with dim yellow lights, echoing laughter, and Miles standing behind the counter, smiling brightly when he saw me walk in. "Colton, you need luck again," he joked as I sat down on the bar stool. "No lottery tickets tonight," I replied, smiling. "Just a cold beer." Miles nodded, placing a bottle of Budweiser in front of me. As soon as I took a sip, the bar door opened and a cold wind blew in. A woman walked in, holding two children by the hand. She looked tired, but her straight posture and bright eyes exuded a strength that was hard to ignore. The two children, a boy and a girl, clung to their mother, their eyes looking around blankly. "Delilah," Miles called out, waving. "Long time no see. Sit down." She nodded, leading the two kids to a table near the counter. As Miles brought out 3 glasses of water and small plates of nachos, I couldn't help but glance in their direction. There was something special about Delilah, a mix of weariness and strong will that made her stand out in the crowded room. "I haven't seen her here before," I said to Miles, gesturing toward Delilah. "She was a regular," Miles replied. "Her husband was in the military. He died a few years ago, and she was raising 2 children on her own. I heard she was having trouble with housing recently." I nodded, feeling a strange feeling in my heart, not pity, but genuine concern that I hadn't expected. On a whim, I stood up and walked toward Delilah's table. "Hi," I said, trying to keep my tone friendly. "I'm Colton. I don't mean to be intrusive, but I thought we could get acquainted." Delilah looked up, her eyes scanning me as if assessing me. After a few seconds, she gave me a small, genuine smile. "Hi, Colton. I'm Delilah. This is Ryder and Emery," she said, gesturing toward the 2 children. I crouched down to Ryder and Emery's level, smiling. "Nice to meet you," I said. "You two like nachos?" Ryder nodded, while Emery smiled sheepishly. Delilah looked at me, surprised. "Do you usually meet strangers like this?" she asked, a hint of teasing in her voice. "Not usually," I admitted, pulling up a chair and sitting down. "But I guess tonight is an exception." Our conversation flowed more naturally than I expected. Delilah told me that she was facing eviction from her apartment because her old building was about to be demolished to make way for a new development. She was working as a freelance copywriter, but the rising cost of living was making it difficult for her and her children to find suitable housing. "It's hard to find a place that's affordable," she admitted, looking down at the table. "I don't want the kids to suffer, but sometimes I feel like I'm failing." "You didn't fail," I said, my voice full of conviction. "Just by the way the 2 kids look at you, I can see you're a great mother." Delilah looked at me, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's not every day I hear that." We continued talking, and I began to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: connection. It seemed that in the small space of this bar, amidst the laughter and soft music, I found something I didn't expect: a little hope. As the conversation continued, I realized that time had passed more quickly than I'd expected. Delilah told me about her journey, from losing her husband in an accident while he was on duty, to the difficult months of raising her children without support, yet she didn't blame her fate. Instead, she talked about the small joys in life, like the time Ryder made a painting for his mother, or when Emery read a story for the first time without help. Her eyes lit up when she talked about her children, as if any hardship could be softened by the unconditional love she had for them. "You're stronger than most people I've ever met," I said, and I meant it. "It's not easy to do all the things you do." Delilah smiled slightly, a little embarrassed. "Thanks, Colton, but honestly, I don't feel very strong. I just do what I have to do to give my kids the best life possible." I don't know what I was thinking in the next moment, but the words came out before I could stop them. "If you need a place to stay, I have a spare room at my house. I know this may sound a little abrupt, but I think you and the kids might be comfortable there." Delilah looked at me, clearly surprised. Ryder and Emery looked up, curious. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice a little hesitant. "Really?" I replied, trying to keep my voice calm so as not to pressure her. "My house is quite large, and since I've been living alone, it's become too empty. If you need time to find a more stable place, I'd be happy to help." Delilah was silent for a few seconds, her eyes assessing the sincerity of the offer. "Colton, I don't know what to say," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I appreciate it, but I don't want to bother you. You have enough on your plate." "No problem," I insisted. "In fact, I think it would help both of us. My house needs a little laughter and liveliness, and I think Ryder and Emery would do a great job of that." The 2 children looked at their mother, eyes full of hope. "Mom, tell me," Ryder said. "Can we?" Delilah smiled slightly. but I could see she was still hesitant. I need to think about it, Colton, she said. But thank you. Thank you for caring about me and my mother. I nodded. You don't have to respond right away. The invitation is always open. We talked a little longer before Delilah decided to take the kids home. Before she left, she turned back to look at me. I really appreciate your offer, she said, and if I decide to accept, I'll let you know soon. I hope so, I replied, smiling. As they left the bar, I felt a strange warmth spread through me, a feeling I hadn't felt in a long time. I didn't know if Delilah would accept my offer, but I realized that for the first time in weeks, I didn't feel alone. The thought of sharing a home, sharing a life with someone, even for a short time, gave me a new sense of hope. 2 days later, I got a call from Delilah. Colton, she said over the phone, her voice a little confused but firm. I've thought it over, and if your offer still stands, my son and I would like to accept it. Great, I replied, trying to keep the excitement out of my voice. You can move in anytime. I'll make sure you and your baby are comfortable. Thank you, Colton, Delilah said. I don't know how to repay you for your kindness. No need to pay anything back, I said. Just think of this as a new beginning for both of us. As I hung up the phone, I found myself smiling. For the first time in months of darkness, I felt like light was filtering through the cracks of my life. Even though I didn't know what the future held, I was ready to open the door to something new and better. The first few weeks after Delilah and the kids moved in were a total transformation for me. The house, once cold and silent, was now filled with laughter and life. Ryder and Emery quickly claimed the backyard as their own, and I often found myself standing by the window, smiling as I watched the two kids chase each other around in the Texas sun. Delilah, on the other hand, quickly made the house feel like a home. She had a way of making simple things meaningful, like placing a vase of wildflowers on the kitchen table or baking a batch of cookies that made the whole house smell good. In the evenings, after the kids were in bed, we would sit on the front porch and talk about life, the past, and what we hoped for the future. Even though they were just casual conversations, they made me feel connected in a way I had long forgotten. However, things weren't always smooth sailing. Living with Delilah and the two kids brought me a lot of joy, but it also brought me to confront complicated emotions. Part of me began to feel that their presence was filling the void left by Aurora, but at the same time, I feared that I was growing dependent on them. I wasn't sure if I was ready for a new relationship, and this doubt gradually turned into an invisible distance between me and Delilah. It all came to a head one Friday afternoon. I had just returned from a meeting with Mackenzie, a former colleague. Mackenzie was a good friend, and she was looking for advice on a project I'd worked on in the past. The meeting was completely innocent, but I realized that I had not told Delilah about it beforehand, partly because I thought it wasn't important, and partly because I didn't want to worry her. When I entered the house, Delilah was standing in the kitchen, her eyes colder than I had ever seen them. "You're home," she said, her tone stopping me in my tracks. "Yeah, I met an old friend," I said, trying to keep my tone light. But when I saw the look on her face, I knew things were not good. "You met Mackenzie, right?" she asked, her eyes fixed on me. I blinked, surprised that she knew this. "Yes, but how did you know?" I asked. Delilah sighed, setting the knife she was holding down on the table. "Ryder saw you and her at the coffee shop when you dropped him off at school. He didn't say anything until we got home." I felt a chill run down my spine, not because I had done anything wrong, but because I realized that my lack of openness had made Delilah feel uneasy. "Delilah, it was just a business meeting," I said. "Mackenzie just needed some advice. Nothing more." She smirked, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Colton, I don't care if it was just business. What I care about is why you didn't tell me. Do you know I've been through this before? People hiding things, lying, and leaving me with doubts." I stood still, speechless for a moment. I understood that this wasn't just about Mackenzie. It was about the wounds Delilah carried from her past, scars I didn't know about. "Delilah," I said, my voice softer. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you, but I didn't want to make you feel uncomfortable. Maybe that was my mistake." She looked at me, her eyes full of emotion. "You don't understand, Colton. I don't need protection or hiding. I just need honesty. If you can't give me that, I don't know how much longer we can go on living together like this." Her words were like a knife through me. It was the first time Delilah had expressed doubts about this arrangement, and I realized that things could fall apart if I didn't do something. But I also knew that appeasing her wasn't the answer I needed to prove that I understood, and that I was willing to face both of our insecurities to build trust. "You're right," I said, sighing. "I was wrong to be dishonest with you, and I'll do everything I can to change that. But please understand that I'm not perfect. I'm also trying to learn to open up after what happened to Aurora." Delilah was silent for a few seconds, then nodded slightly. "I don't expect perfection, Colton. I just need to know that you won't hide anything from me." We stood there, heavy but not completely hopeless. I knew this was a crucial turning point, a chance for us to learn to face the past and build a real future based on openness and trust. But whether we could do it, I was still not sure. That evening, the house was quieter than usual. Ryder and Emery had gone to bed early, but I knew Delilah was still awake. I could feel it in the light coming through her bedroom door. I sat on the sofa, trying to muster the courage to talk to her again. Delilah's words from that afternoon kept echoing in my head that she didn't need protection or concealment, but honesty. It was simple, but also challenging for someone like me, used to keeping difficult emotions to myself. Finally, I stood up and walked over to Delilah's door and knocked lightly. There was a soft sound of footsteps, and then she opened the door, her expression still showing hesitation. "Can I come in?" I asked, my voice softer than usual. She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. Her room was simply furnished, but cozy, a small nook with a bookshelf, a desk, and a few hand-drawn pictures of Ryder and Emery hanging on the wall. She sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes fixed on mine. "Delilah," I began, my hands clasped together. "I know I disappointed you today, and I don't want to be dismissive of that, but I want you to know that I didn't mean to be secretive. I just didn't know how to handle things." She tilted her head slightly, as if to encourage me to continue. "I'm not good at sharing," I said, sighing. "After what happened to Aurora, I was used to closing myself off. I thought if I didn't say anything, I wouldn't hurt anyone. But apparently, that wasn't true. Instead of protecting you, I made you feel betrayed, and I'm sorry for that." Delilah listened quietly, her eyes never leaving mine. When I paused, she sighed, her voice soft but firm. "Colton, I understand that you're carrying your own wounds, and I don't want to impose or demand immediate change on you. But if we're going to live together, if we're going to build anything, the first thing I need is honesty. Not because I doubt you, but because I don't want to repeat the mistakes of the past." I nodded, feeling a small sense of relief at hearing her say that. "I will try, Delilah. I can't promise I'll get it right every time, but I will try." She smiled, a gentle smile that still held a hint of reserve. That's all I needed to hear. We sat there for a few minutes, saying nothing more. But the silence this time wasn't as heavy as before. It felt like a reconciliation, a reminder that we were both imperfect humans, but willing to strive for something better. The next day, I decided to make a move to prove that I was truly willing to change. I didn't want my apologies to be just words. So, after dropping Ryder and Emery off at school, I stopped by a small flower shop on my way home. Yellow tulips, Delilah's favorite color, as she had mentioned in a casual conversation, were in my hand when I returned home. Delilah was sitting at the kitchen table, working on her computer. When I walked in, she looked up, her eyes widening at the sight of the flowers. "This is for you," I said, setting the flowers down on the table. "Not to apologize, but to thank you. Thank you for being patient with me, and thank you for not giving up." Delilah looked at the flowers, then at me. Her eyes filled with a tenderness I couldn't place. "Thank you, Colton," she said, her voice trembling. "This means more than you think." From that moment on, everything began to change. I stopped keeping everything to myself. I learned to share, from the little things I planned for my day to the emotions I usually avoided. And Delilah, with her patience and understanding, helped me every step of the way. While we still have many challenges ahead, I know that as long as we are open and honest, we can get through them. What about Ryder and Emery? They had no idea about the argument between me and their mother, but I realized that my actions had a bigger impact than I thought. One evening, while I was helping Ryder with his math homework, he suddenly said, "Uncle Colton, I think Mom is happier since you came along." I looked at it, feeling a lump in my throat. "Really, Ryder?" The boy nodded, smiling. "Yeah, me too." Those words were not only encouragement, but also a reminder that my efforts were not just for Delilah, but for these two children. They needed more than just a home. They needed a family, a safe place to feel love and stability. And I realized that, although the road ahead was long, I was willing to walk with them to create that. My new life with Delilah and the two kids was settling in. Every day, I felt closer to building a real family. Not perfect, but full of sincerity and warmth. Ryder and Emery had made me a part of their lives. Quiet evenings, we ate dinner together, played board games, and told jokes until the whole house rang with laughter. It was a life I never dreamed of after the breakup with Aurora. But then, one quiet Saturday afternoon, the past knocked on the door again. I was in the backyard, fixing the wooden fence that Ryder and Emery had accidentally damaged during a chase. Footsteps sounded from the front of the house, and I glanced over my shoulder when I heard Delilah call out, "Colton, someone's looking for you." I wiped my hands on the towel hanging from my belt and walked into the house. My heart stopped when I saw the person standing on the porch, Aurora. She was as beautiful as the day she left. Her cream-colored dress hugged her slender figure perfectly. Her hair fell in soft waves over her shoulders. But what surprised me most was not her appearance, but her eyes. They no longer had the confidence and arrogance of the past. Instead, I saw fatigue, regret, and something I never thought I would see in Aurora: weakness. "Hi, Colton," she said, her voice soft but laced with worry. I stood there for a moment, not knowing what to say. Delilah, who had been standing nearby, quietly stepped aside, leaving me to face the woman who had once been my wife. "Aurora," I replied, trying to keep my voice even. "What are you doing here?" She bit her lip, as if gathering the courage to reply. "I know you probably don't want to see me, but I need to talk to you. Just for a moment." I didn't know what to feel. Part of me wanted to tell her to go away, that her presence no longer mattered. But another part, the fragile part still held by old memories, urged me to hear her out. I nodded, gesturing toward the dining room table. "Come in," I said. "But don't take too long." Aurora walked in, and I could feel Delilah's eyes watching us from afar. I couldn't blame her. I didn't know where this was going either. Aurora sat down, her hands clasped together on the table. I sat across from her, keeping my distance, my arms crossed over my chest. "So," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral, "what do you want to say?" "I want to apologize, Colton," she began, her voice shaking more than I expected. "For everything I did, for the way I left, for how selfish I was, and for hurting you." I didn't respond right away. Her apologies rang in the air between us as something foreign and unreal. "So, why did you come now?" I asked, staring at her. Aurora sighed, her shoulders slumping. "I thought I knew what I wanted," she said, looking down at her hands. "But I was wrong. I left a good man, the only one who truly loved me, for something that wasn't real." I frowned, still on guard. "So, what changed?" Aurora looked up, her eyes red. "I tried to find happiness in other relationships, but they were all liars, only caring about themselves. No one really cared about me like you did." She paused, fighting back tears. "I don't know if you can forgive me, but I want you back, Colton. I want us to start over." Her words made my heart clench, but not in the way she expected. I looked at the woman who had meant everything to me, who had left me when I needed her the most, and I realized that I no longer felt the same way about her. All I felt was relief. Relief that I could finally let go of the past. I shook my head, keeping my eyes on her. "Aurora, it took me a long time to get over what you did, but now I realize I don't love you anymore." She looked at me, shock written all over her face. "Colton, I know I messed up, but I can do it again. I can change." "Maybe," I said, my voice calm. "But it doesn't matter anymore. You made your choice, and now I have too. I have found a new life, a life where I no longer need you." Aurora was silent, as if my words were sinking in. I didn't say more, and I didn't need to. Instead, I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. Good luck, Aurora, I said as she left, without any bitterness in my voice. I hope you find what you're looking for. Aurora looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with emotions I couldn't and didn't want to decipher. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling like I had just lifted a burden that had been on my shoulders for years. I stood at the door, watching Aurora leave. It felt like a chapter in my life had finally been closed, not with anger or resentment, but with acceptance and release. As the front gate closed softly behind her, I realized that I no longer felt pain or regret. Aurora was a part of my past, and I was ready to move on from it completely. I walked back into the house, through the living room, where Delilah was sitting in an armchair by the window. She looked at me questioningly but didn't rush into any further conversation. Instead, she let me find my own way to start the conversation. I sat down on the sofa opposite, sighing, trying to clear my mind of the last thoughts of our encounter. She wants to come back, I said, my voice flat. Delilah nodded, unsurprised. I guess so, she replied softly. But what did you say? I looked up, meeting Delilah's eyes. I said no. I don't love her anymore, and I don't want to go back to the past. Delilah was silent for a moment, as if considering her answer. Are you sure? She asked, not in doubt, but as if to make sure I had really made the right decision. Absolutely, I said, without hesitation. Aurora was a big part of my life, but she's not a part of my life anymore. She hurt me, but because of her, I realized I deserve a better life, a life that isn't tied to my past mistakes. Delilah smiled, a soft but warm smile. I'm glad you found your answer. We sat there for a while, neither of us saying anything, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt peaceful, as if we both knew the storm had passed and the sky was clearer now. The next day, I decided to spend some time with Ryder and Emery to remind myself of what was most important in my life right now. I took the kids to a nearby park where they could run around freely and get some fresh air. Delilah didn't come along because she had a freelance project to finish. I knew she needed time to focus, and I wanted to spend some time alone with the kids. At the park, Ryder and Emery ran straight to the swings and slides. I sat on a nearby wooden bench, watching them as I thought about everything. The relief from yesterday was still there, but now I was starting to think more about the future. My life with Delilah and the two kids wasn't what I'd planned, but it was becoming the most important thing to me. I knew that if I wanted to move forward, I needed to figure out how I felt and make sure Delilah felt the same way. Colton! Ryder shouted, interrupting my thoughts. I looked up and saw him waving from the top of the slide. Look at me. I smiled and waved back. Great, Ryder, I see. Emery ran up to me, his face beaming. Uncle Colton, can you push me on the swing? Of course, I said, standing up and leading her to the swings. The children's laughter echoed throughout the park, and I realized that this was a moment I wanted to cherish forever. When we returned home, Delilah was standing in the kitchen preparing dinner. She turned and smiled when she saw the three of us enter. How was your day? She asked, returning to the stove to stir a pot of soup on the stove. Great, I said, placing Ryder and Emery's backpacks on the shelf. They've been running around so much, I think they'll be asleep right after dinner. Delilah smiled, and in that moment, I realized that this was the family I had been looking for. Imperfect, unconventional, but full of love and connection. I walked closer to her, putting my hand on her shoulder. Delilah, I said, my voice soft but firm. Thank you for everything. She turned back to look at me, her eyes surprised. Thank me for what? For helping me find myself, I said. For giving me the opportunity to be a part of your life and the children's. She smiled, a smile I knew I would never forget. We need you too, Colton. Maybe more than you think. That evening, as we sat around the dinner table, I couldn't help but think that, although the journey to get here had not been easy, I had found my place. And for the first time in a long time, I felt completely, utterly happy. Life after Aurora was more peaceful than ever. I felt like I'd officially closed one chapter and opened a new one with Delilah and the kids. But in the back of my mind, I kept one secret, the $25,000 I won from the lottery. I never told anyone, not even Delilah, not because I didn't trust her, but because I didn't know how to use it most meaningfully. But the longer I lived in this house, With this family, the clearer it became to me what I had to do. One evening, after Ryder and Emery had gone to bed, Delilah and I sat on the front porch, as we always did. It was my favorite time of day when the air was crisp, the sky was full of stars, and everything felt quiet. I decided it was time to stop keeping this secret. Delilah, I began, my voice slow, I need to tell you something. She turned to look at me, slightly surprised by my serious tone. What is it? I was keeping a secret, I said, struggling to find the right words. When Aurora left, I won a lottery ticket, $25,000. Delilah blinked, her eyes wide with surprise. Are you serious? I mean it, I replied, smiling, and I kept it in my account, untouched. At the time, I thought I would use it for something more meaningful, but I didn't know what that meaning was, until now. Delilah was still looking at me, but her surprise was slowly turning to curiosity. Now you know what you're going to do with it? I nodded, taking a deep breath. I want to use it to fix up this house, to make it a real family place. Not just a place to live, but a home. A place that you, Ryder, Emery, and I can call home forever. She was silent, her eyes sparkling as she tried to process what I had just said. Colton, she said softly, her voice full of emotion, you don't have to do that. We're happy with what we have. I know, I replied, but this isn't just for you. This is for me too. I want to do this, to prove that we're not just living together, that we really belong together as a family. Delilah smiled, and this time her smile was warm. Thank you, Colton, she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. We are truly blessed to have you. I think I'm the lucky one, I replied, touching her hand lightly. We sat there for a long time, without saying another word. In the dim light of the street lamps, I knew I'd made the right decision, and for the first time, I felt genuinely excited about the future, not just for what I could do, but for who I could do it with. The next morning, I began to plan the details of the renovation. I found a few local contractors to consult and get quotes. My idea was not to turn the house into a lavish mansion, but to make it more cozy and suitable for a family. A larger bedroom for Delilah and the kids, a small outdoor area for Ryder and Emery to play in, and a brighter living room where we could enjoy quiet evenings together. Delilah couldn't hide her surprise at my enthusiasm. You're really serious about this, she said, as I spread a rough sketch out on the dining table. Of course, I said, pointing to the areas I'd marked. This will be your new bedroom and mine. The current one will be for Ryder and Emery, with bunk beds so they have more space to play. And I want to build a larger porch in the backyard, so we can sit and watch the sunset or have barbecues. She looked at me with emotion in her eyes. Colton, you don't need to do all this just to impress us. We're already happy here. I know, I replied, placing my hand on hers. But I don't want us to live here just as a temporary arrangement. I want us to have a real home, a place where you and I can all feel like we belong. Delilah didn't say anything more, but I could see the appreciation in her eyes. That only made me more determined. I began spending my free afternoons cleaning up and preparing for the renovation. Ryder and Emery eagerly pitched in, from picking up leaves in the backyard to cleaning out old furniture in the shed. Ryder was especially fond of the idea of a new bunk bed, and Emery kept asking if she could pick the paint color for the bedroom. Uncle Colton, Emery said one afternoon, while we were testing a wall, are you going to be here forever? I stopped, looking at her with soft eyes. Of course, Emery, I said. I'm not going anywhere. This is my home, and it's your home too. She grinned, and I felt warm inside. It was those little but meaningful moments that made me realize I was on the right track. A few weeks later, the renovations began. The workers arrived and worked hard, removing old parts of the house and replacing them with new materials. Every day, I watched the house change, becoming a space that was not only more beautiful, but also filled with the potential for new memories. Delilah and I often stood outside, watching the work in progress. Once, as we watched one of the new walls go up, she took my hand. You know, Colton, she said, I never thought I'd have the chance to feel this peaceful, and it's because of you. Thanks to you, I replied, smiling. Without you and the kids, I wouldn't have had a reason to do all this. By the end of the month, the house was nearly finished. Ryder and Emery were delighted to see their new bedrooms, with their blue walls and cartoons I'd hung up myself. Delilah loved the new kitchen with its large wooden table where we could eat breakfast together, but my favorite part was the porch in the backyard, where I imagined we would spend hours talking or just enjoying the peace. One evening, when everyone was asleep, I sat on the porch, sipping a cold beer and looking up at the starry sky. I thought about my journey, from pain and loss to finding hope and rebuilding my life. I realized that sometimes we need to lose something to find what is truly important. Delilah came out, wearing a light sweater. She sat down next to me, a cup of hot tea in her hand. "What's on your mind?" she asked. "I was thinking about everything that led me here," I replied, turning to look at her. "And I feel grateful for everything." She smiled, placing her hand on mine. "We're grateful to you too, Colton. You've changed my life and my mother's in ways I never could have imagined." We sat there in comfortable silence, looking up at the twinkling stars in the Texas sky. I didn't know what the future would bring, but I knew that I had found my place, and that, for me, was enough. As time passed, the newly renovated house was no longer a dusty construction site, but a warm, vibrant living space. Ryder and Emery now had the room they had always wanted, with colorful walls and toys neatly arranged on shelves. The back porch became a place for the family to gather on afternoons when the golden sunsets filled the Texas sky, and laughter filled the warm air. One Saturday morning, as the sun streamed through the windows, I woke up to the sounds of life, the sound of tiny feet running across the wooden floor, Ryder and Emery's giggles, and the smell of pancakes Delilah was cooking in the kitchen. I lay in bed for a few minutes, taking it all in, a peace I never thought I would experience. "Uncle Colton," Ryder called from the hallway, his voice full of excitement. "Wake up! You have to eat Mom's pancakes." I laughed, sat up, and put on my slippers. When I entered the kitchen, I saw Delilah standing by the stove, wearing a light sweater and her hair pulled back. On the table was a large plate of pancakes, with syrup and fresh fruit beside them. Ryder and Emery were already seated, their eyes shining when they saw me. "Good morning," Delilah said, turning back to smile. "Did you sleep well?" "Very good," I replied, pulling up a chair next to Ryder. "But not as good as this smells." "Eat up," Emery urged, handing a plate of pancakes to me. Breakfast that morning was filled with laughter and random stories from Ryder and Emery, from new lessons at school to games they made up in the backyard. Delilah and I looked at each other across the table, both knowing that these little moments are what make life meaningful. After breakfast, the family decided to head out to the town's fall festival. It was an annual event that I hadn't attended in a long time, but for Ryder and Emery, it was a whole new experience. We drove through familiar streets where houses were decorated with pumpkins, scarecrows, and warm yellow lights. At the festival, Ryder was immediately drawn to the bottle toss game, while Emery eagerly dragged me to the cotton candy booth. Delilah walked beside me, her smile never fading. Seeing the two children happily running between the booths filled my heart with joy. As we stopped at the crafts booth, Delilah pointed to a small oil painting of a house with a large porch and a family gathered around. "Look at this," she said, her voice soft. "It looks like us, doesn't it?" I nodded, looking at the painting with a strange sense of warmth. "Yes," I said, "a real family." Delilah smiled, and I knew she felt what I felt. We didn't need anything more, not luxury, not the approval of others. We just needed each other and moments like this, where everything felt full and meaningful. As the sun began to set, casting a warm golden glow over the entire festival, I lifted Emery onto my shoulders, while Ryder pulled Delilah by the hand. Together, we walked down the gravel path toward the car, our hearts light and our faces smiling. When we returned home from the festival, Ryder and Emery were exhausted from a long day of running around. Delilah picked up Emery and gently placed her in bed, while I helped Ryder change out of his muddy play clothes. The two children fell asleep almost immediately, their faces glowing with smiles still lingering from their afternoon of play. Delilah and I quickly cleaned up the kitchen, where bags of fresh apples, candy, and crafts Ryder and Emery had picked out were piled high. Once everything was neatly arranged, we sat down at the dining table, where the soft light from the ceiling light fixtures created a warm atmosphere. "Today was wonderful," Delilah said, breaking the silence. She leaned her elbows on the table, her hands clasped together, looking at me with soft eyes. Thank you for creating moments like this for me and my baby. It was you and the kids, I replied, smiling. It was your presence that made it all worthwhile. We sat there in silence for a while, enjoying the peaceful atmosphere. I felt a change in myself. From a man who had suffered loss, I had now found a family, a place where I truly belonged. For the next few weeks, life continued with simple joys. Delilah and I tended to the house, worked in the garden, and prepared for the coming winter. Dinners around the table had become a meaningful routine, where the whole family gathered to talk about their day. I realized that I didn't need grand events or expensive gifts. Just the presence of people in my life was the most precious thing. One evening, as we sat on the porch, watching the lights of the neighboring houses twinkle, Delilah turned to me and put her hand on mine. "Colton," she said, her voice soft but serious, "do you think we're really becoming a family?" I turned back to look at her, her eyes sparkling in the soft light. "I don't think we're a family," I said, squeezing her hand. "I think we are." Those words were an affirmation, not just for Delilah, but for me. Everything I had been through, the betrayal, the loneliness, the pain, had led me to this moment. I realized that no matter how difficult the journey, I could still find happiness and meaning in the simplest things. A few days later, one Sunday morning, while Delilah was baking in the kitchen and Ryder and Emery were playing in the living room, I took a piece of paper and a pen from a drawer. I began writing a letter to myself, a letter that I hoped would remind me never to forget the lessons of this journey. Colton, life will always be full of challenges and losses. There will be times when everything falls apart and you feel like there is nothing left to go on. But remember, in the darkest moments, there is always light waiting. It can come in the little things you don't expect. A smile, a kind word, or people who walk into your life when you least expect it. Family is not always about blood, but about those who choose to stay, love, and support you. Cherish them, love them with all your heart, because they will be your greatest source of strength and joy. And don't forget, you deserve happiness, even if you think you don't. Sincerely, you. As I put the pen down, I felt a surge of gratitude. I folded the letter and put it in a little drawer, where I could find it whenever I needed a reminder.